All right, pre-AP biology. This is the second half of the lecture videos for today. We left off in the last video. I had brought up Charles Darwin, and I said that he was kind of the father of all modern evolutionary thought. All the things that we pretty much know about evolution and natural selection were originally written by him. But he was influenced heavily by the teachings of all these other scientists we talked about yesterday. Lamarck and Cuvier and Malthus and all these guys. So let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin. He's probably one of the most famous biologists of all time. Charles Darwin. Early in his life, this is him later in his life, obviously, but early in his life, he believed pretty much what everybody else believed. Prior to 1850, and that was that every species was created to match their habitats, and species didn't change and they never went extinct, and all these popular ideas, again, proper to 1850. So again, this idea that species can change was kind of absurd. Why would they ever need to? They were perfectly created to fit their environment. Well, when Darwin was 22 years old, he sailed aboard the HMS Beagle. That's the name of his boat. It's kind of a historical thing. You'll maybe remember that. But he sailed to a place called the Galapagos Islands, which is a small group of islands off the western coast of South America. He did a lot of his studies there. He studied elsewhere around the world as well. But just to kind of make a long story short, after spending several years there and studying and writing things down in a journal, he ended up, kind of changing his mind, about this idea that species never changed, this idea that, living things stay constant. For example, I'll just use polar bears as an example. I've been using that one for a couple of days now. Polar bears, according to the popular belief before 1850, would never change. Their species would never evolve. But according to Darwin, that's not so true. Polar bears, like every species, changes with the environment. If the environment changes, then the species will change, and if the species doesn't change, then it's possibly subject to going extinct. Now, in 1859, Darwin published his book called The Origin of Species. And The Origin of Species was, again, probably some of the most important biology ever written. But you got to remember, at the time this book was written, it was written in 1859, back when the popular belief was not necessarily shared with Charles Darwin. His ideas were a little bit more radical. So these are some of the things that Darwin kind of came up with. This term evolve. I want us to make sure we know what it means. It means that a population is changing. It's changing genetically over time. And if a population is changing genetically, that means that P and Q values are changing. Now, Darwin didn't know anything about population genetics and P and Q values, but these values that we learned in the last unit about population genetics, we know what these represent, right? They represent the frequencies of dominant and recessive alleles in the gene pool. So if a species is changing, if a population is changing, then those numbers are changing as well. But this idea that a species would change, it's all driven by the environment. Of course, if the planet is constant and it's fixed and nothing ever changes, then you're right. I mean, a species probably wouldn't ever need to change. And some species, I'll be honest with you, have not changed much in millions and millions of years. One of those reasons why is because their environment hasn't changed very much. But for most species, the environment has changed, and there has been a need to change. But I want us to start thinking, as the this term evolution, evolving, this isn't a bad thing. Evolution is a wonderful thing. It's a good thing for a species. It means that a species is changing along with its environment. Because if the environment around the organism is being altered, if it's changing, then that species is going to have to change as well. That's a very, very important thing. Now, how a species changes is kind of the trick. Like, how does this actually occur? Well, that's where Darwin was kind of a genius. Darwin actually figured out the mechanism, what it was that actually causes a species to evolve. And he gave it a name. It was called natural selection. Now, natural selection kind of has several different components to it. And these things don't necessarily happen in a certain order. But in order for a species to evolve, these things happen. Okay. And I want us to think about each one of these individually. Number one, a species produces more offspring than can survive. But think about, for example, fish. Let's say a largemouth bass, for example. A female bass, when she, lays her eggs, is she only laying one egg? If you know anything about fish, fish lay hundreds of eggs. Now, why do they do that? Right? I mean, they do that because most of those eggs are probably not going to survive. They might get eaten by a predator. They might just die before the eggs can hatch. Maybe weather has something to do with that. Maybe they freeze, whatever. But if you lay hundreds of eggs, then there's a chance that at least one of those eggs will survive, hatch into a baby, a guppy, a little baby fish, a minnow, and eventually one day that fish will reproduce. Now, when it comes to other organisms like humans, for example, humans don't have 100 babies at one time, and that's because when humans give birth to one child, that one child has a very good chance of surviving and eventually living long enough to reproduce. So species produce enough offspring to ensure survival. Okay. Some organisms produce hundreds of babies, some organisms only produce a couple, but that's all dependent on the organism. Number two, there's genetic variety amongst all the members of a species. Do you think all polar bears are exactly alike genetically? No, they're not. Are all giraffes exactly the same genetically? No, they're not exactly the same. Are humans all exactly the same? Fish, birds? No. There's genetic variety amongst all the members of a species. Number three, there's competition for resources. This is what Wallace and Malthus said, that, hey, if you've got a bunch of, let's say, I don't know, lions living in the Serengeti of Africa, those lions are competing. Some lions are better fit to track down an antelope and eat it compared to others. But I mean, organisms compete. They compete for food, they compete for shelter, they compete for mates. That's called survival of the fittest, right? The strong survive, the ones with the best traits are the ones that'll be able to reproduce and pass those genes on to the next generation. And that kind of ties into number four here. This competition is what eventually separates the organisms that are best fit to survive versus the ones that aren't. And those ones that are best fit, those are the ones that have those favorable traits. They're the ones that have the best chances of breeding and passing those traits on to the next generation. So what this does is it ensures that the next generation is better than the previous generation. It's good that the fast Strong lions are the ones that are the best fit to survive because they're the ones that can pass their genes on. Imagine if all the slow, overweight, lions that didn't have very good vision. Imagine if those lions were the ones that were best fit, but they're not, right? The best genetically suited are the ones that have the best chances of not only surviving, but also reproducing. So, one thing that we have to remember is what this does to the gene pool. Right? The gene pool is all the genes for all the members of the species, of that population. You know, the less favorable genes, eventually they make their way out of the gene pool. Those organisms don't survive, they don't get to pass their genes on, and they die. And those genes go along with them. The more favorable genes, they stay in the gene pool. So that's what alters your P and Q. And this, again, ensures that the best genes get passed on to the next generation. Organisms have the best traits, have the best chance of survival, and this is good for a species. Think of our giraffes again. Let's say you have 4 giraffes here, and this red line here, this represents food. The height of the trees that these giraffes can reach, and they can obtain food. Well, obviously, this giraffe right here, the one that has the longest neck, he's the one that's best suited to survive. He's the one that can reach those trees the easiest. These other ones, it's a much greater struggle for them. So who has the best chance to survive? This guy does, right? He has the best chance to eventually reproduce and pass on his genes. Now, does that mean he's going to? No, some poacher can come by and just blow his head off, right, with a shotgun. I mean, that happens all the time. It's against the law, but I mean, that doesn't mean that this guy will reproduce. It just means that he has the best chance to, and most likely, if this will play out this way amongst all the members of the species. Can we see evolution? The answer is yes, we can see it. I mean, this is an example of natural selection happening in bacteria. Let's say, for example, you go to the doctor and let's say you have strep throat, right? You go to the doctor, he does a throat culture. He says, oh, yeah, you got strep throat. Strep throat is caused by a bacteria that lives in the back of your throat. And all those bacteria, let's say these colored dots here on the left, let's say these are the bacteria that are causing disease, they're causing strep throat. Well, every single one of these bacteria are a little bit different, right? There's genetic variety. So your doctor says, okay, here's some antibiotics. You'll take 2 pills a day for 2 weeks, and you're good to go. Just make sure you finish the prescription. So you go home and you start taking your pills, right? 2 a day for 2 weeks. And what starts happening? These bacteria start to die off. Well, here's the thing. These bacteria all have different resistance levels to this antibiotic. These lighter colored ones, they have very low resistance. So those are the ones that die off first, these little pink guys. And some of the darker colored ones start to die off. And as you're taking your pills and as the days are going by, you're killing them off. So let's kind of think here a little bit about how this is going to work, right? I mean, let's say, for example, again, these guys here die off first. This one dies off. This one here. Let's just say all these, again, kind of lighter colored ones, as the days go by, they start to die. So let's say after about 10 days or so, you start feeling pretty good. And you're like, well, I got a couple days left of my prescription. I'm not gonna take the rest of my pills. I feel pretty good. Well, even though you've killed off most of these bacteria, a few of them survived, right? You didn't finish your prescription. So now these bacteria survive. They're the ones that are the most resistant. So what are they going to do? They're going to reproduce. Our bacteria are asexual, so they reproduce to produce, to repopulate. So now here's the next generation. Now you've got all these bacteria living in the back of your throat. Now you're sick again. You go back to the doctor, and the doctor takes a throat swab, and he's like, "Whoa, now these bacteria are much stronger." So now he's going to have to give you probably a stronger antibiotic to kill them off. So this is called antibiotic resistance, and this is becoming a real problem. These bacteria are resisting the drugs, so we have to come up with better drugs than they're resisting. We got to come up with better ones. But I mean, this could all be resolved as long as we finish our antibiotic prescription. That should be enough to kill them all. But if we don't do that, if we misuse antibiotics, well, then that could cause this type of stuff to occur. So we have to be really careful with that type of thing. Now, here's another example of the of natural selection. This is called the peppered moth, and this was a study that was done in the 1950s. It was done in England by a guy named Bernard Kettlewell. Kettlewell um, noticed that this peppered moth came in two different colors. It comes in black and it comes in white. Now, this picture on the left, you can't really see it too well, but the white peppered moth, I believe, is right in here. Let me change my color of that pen there real quick. That white pepper moth is actually right in here. It's kind of hard to see it a little bit, but it's right in there. I believe that's where it is. But anyway, you can see that, for example, the white peppered moth is very well camouflaged, right? I mean, it blends in very well with the bark of the tree. The dark colored moth sticks out like an apple in an orange barrel. So let me ask you this question: if you just look at the picture on the left, which color is more likely to survive? Right? It's the white colored one, right? The white colored one can hide from predators. It doesn't get eaten, whereas this dark colored one, can easily get eaten. But color is caused by a gene. It's caused by a trait. So let's think about this, for example. Let's say that, I don't know, the white colored moth, let's say that white color is caused by a dominant gene. We'll use B's, okay? So capital B, and we'll use lowercase b. All right, and let's say in this example that black dominates white. Okay, whatever. Let's just say B is black. I'm writing with my finger here. Okay, and then the little b is white. Okay, I'll just put W for white. All right. Anyway, so if you look at this picture on the left, let's think about P and Q values, right? Our P and our Q, right? The frequency of the dominant and the frequency of the recessive. Well, the recessive allele in this picture on the left seems to be doing pretty well, right? I mean, those white moths are very well adapted. Let's just say that our Q value is 0.8. I'm just going to make up a number. It's really high because those organisms seem to be doing very well. Our Q value, rather than our P value, though, is 0.2. All right, it's much lower, and that can happen. In fact, in this picture on the left, that's very well possible. These black moths are probably in much lower abundance because they stick out. Now, this is what Kettlewell figured out. This was kind of interesting. He studied this population of peppered moths in England for years. And one of the things that happened was the environment changed. There was factories that were built, and there was soot coming out of the smokestacks. And guess what happened to the coloration of those trees? Those trees became darker because of all the pollution in the environment. So take a look here on the right-hand side. Now the trees look like this. So now let me ask you, which moth now is more likely to survive compared to the other one? Yeah, now the black ones are more likely to survive. The white ones are now struggling to survive. So what ended up happening was these P and Q values almost flip-flopped. Now the recessive allele went down and the dominant allele rose. So, I mean, what he noticed was there was this change in the population, and that change caused these frequencies to alter. So we're seeing the change, we're seeing evolution occur. And I mean, imagine what might eventually happen to these white moths. They might all be gone eventually. And if that's the case, the white peppered moth is now extinct. So evolution can cause certain members of the population to go extinct. And that's what Kettlewell was noticing here. All right. The last couple of things I just want to mention to you. One of them is called artificial selection. Artificial selection is this idea that instead of nature choosing, which organisms survive, which organisms breed, in this case, it's humans selecting which organisms are best fit to breed. Let's use the example of racehorses. This racehorse, and let's say, for example, that you own, say you're a racehorse owner. Let's say you own 10 racehorses. 9 of them have never won a race. They constantly come in last place. But you've got one horse. You got one horse that wins the Kentucky Derby. That's this guy right here. So you're going to breed your horses. Well, which horse are you going to pick to breed with? I mean, you're going to pick the champion. You're going to pick this guy to be the father of your next generation of horses. I mean, you don't want those loser, slow horses breeding. You want your champion. In fact, people pay millions of dollars for 1 ounce of champion racehorse sperm so that they can impregnate their female horses and hopefully produce the next generation of champions. But the horses aren't choosing who's breeding. Nature's not choosing. It's people. People are picking which horses breed and which ones don't. That's called artificial selection. Okay. Now, one more thing before you go today. It's a concept called common ancestry. And this is another thing that Darwin mentioned in his book. He said that if you've got 2 species, that share a lot of traits. For example, this picture here on the left, this is a wolf. These are wolves. They live in the wild, right? This picture on the right, this is a dog. This is a husky. Okay, if anybody knows what huskies look like. If you look at those 2 organisms, they look very similar. In fact, a lot of people, if you just look at the 2 pictures, you may not be able to tell them apart, unless you kind of know what you're looking for. But these 2 organisms here, this is a dog, this is a wolf, they are not members of the same species. They cannot breed and produce fertile offspring. But you can tell that physically they've got to be close. They do share a lot of genetic similarities. They share a lot of physical similarities. But what Darwin said is that if 2 species share those things, if they look alike, if they behave similarly, if they have the same physical traits, genetically they're similar, but they're not exactly the same, they must have what we call a common ancestor. Now, one thing that Darwin got in a little bit of trouble for was he made a claim that there are organisms on this planet that share very similar traits with humans. You know, chimpanzees, primates, gorillas, you know, they share a lot of physical and even behavioral traits with human beings. And Darwin said, well, if humans and chimpanzees are that they're so close, you know, genetically, even physically, if you look at the physical similarities, then humans and apes shared a common ancestor. Well, that got him in a lot of hot water. You know, this the fact that you're mentioning that humans and apes belong together in the same sentence, we're part of the same evolutionary tree. A lot of people didn't like that. Okay, but we will talk about that more as the weeks go by. That's just something I wanted to introduce to you today. All right, guys, we'll end here today. Have a good day, and I'll see you soon. Take care.